It was in the early 40s. It was during the war. My grandmother used to take us on Saturdays. On Saturdays they had double features. And we'd hear about them through trailers,
Okay.
as you said, which seemed funny because I always thought that was strange because the trailers were really previews. They weren't trailers, but that is what they called them. And then you'd get all excited and you'd beg your parents or your grandparents to take you to see those movies. As I said, on Saturdays it was a double feature, usually a Western and a mystery, and they were all black and white. You would dress nicely. You wouldn't dress in play clothes.
Right.
You would dress nicely. And my grandmother always was the one who took us most often because my mother worked during those years that my dad was overseas. And she'd take us to the local ice cream shop for lunch either before or after the movie, depending on what time we went. And it was a really nice outing, and it was probably, one of the most fun things we did as little kids. The movie was, I believe, 25 cents, and that was for everybody, adults and children alike. And they had a popcorn machine, I remember that, and they had soft drink fountain, but it was not like they are today. It was just a little spot in the lobby where you could get popcorn and something to drink. I think probably the earliest ones would have been the Westerns with Roy Rogers and the other early Western stars. Very primitive. And but they all had a theme of the good guy in white hat. And they all had a lot of action, riding over the plains and so on, but it was a lot less fluid than the movies you have now. Well, ours were actually, this was in Minerva, Ohio. This was a little town in east central Ohio. And to most people it was nowhere. It's just a little town. But it was a nice place to grow up, and you could walk to the movie. The movie was the Roxy, like a lot of them were then. It had a nice marquee, a big marquee out front, and the ticket agent sat out in front in a booth, not inside like they are today. Our theater was fairly simple. It had red plush seats, that I always remembered. That was fun to sit in. And one screen, and it was just an average size screen, probably not a lot bigger than some home screens today. But it was great to us. No, just back then they named, the theaters were named Roxy. I don't know why, but there have been television shows made about theaters in small towns, and they're usually the Roxy. So I assume that there were just lots of them named that, and I have no idea why they named it. RKO movies were big, but I don't know if that had anything to do with the naming of the Roxy. It's just what it was called. And the marquee was another way of getting you to the movie, because they put the stars up there. Sometimes the stars were bigger than the movie, so they'd have that be first. When it was a movie that was particularly, D-Day the 6th of June, that was a big movie. Any of those big movies, they'd have the movie name first and the stars would be underneath. Not like now, where sometimes they don't even have the names of the stars. It's just the movie that they've hyped so much, and they don't even have the name of the stars. I believe that was, I think, in the early 40s. I had an aunt and uncle who worked for Technicolor out in California, and I know they worked on the first color movies. And Fantasia was the first one. And then later, they started having, and then most of those were the animated films that came out in color. And then later, Song of the South, which came out, still had animation, but it also had people in it. And it was a very lasting film. It's been shown to my generation, your mother and dad's generation, and your generation. We moved to Dallas in 1962, and there were a lot more theaters, of course, and I can remember, because we had little children then, we didn't go to a lot of movies, but the ones we did usually were ones where we could take the children. And at that time, that was when Grandpa was in the beginning stages of his career as a CPA, so we didn't have a lot of money to go to movies. So we would sometimes, this might interest your group, we had drive-ins then. And we would pop our own popcorn, take our own beverages, and we'd go to the drive-in. The children could sleep in the back seat, and we could watch the movie. So then we did see some more movies, and a lot of them were musicals. We also went to see a lot of flying movies, and those were well done. Yes, that was just kind of a nice perk of living in Dallas, because Grandpa worked for Price Waterhouse, and one of their clients was Buena Vista Films. So and I used to hear the stories of when he and another man would go to audit at Buena Vista, they'd take sack lunches, and then during their lunch hour, they would go in and sit in the balcony of the theater and watch the movie as they were eating their lunch. And of course, they had to go more than one day in order to get to see all the movie, because they couldn't just stay till the end. They were on their lunch hour and working there. Another nice thing about him being there with when he was auditing Buena Vista, through that we were also invited to the opening of the Frank Lloyd Wright Theater in Dallas. And I'm not sure which year that was dedicated, but I believe it was 63 or 64. And that was a very nice experience. We were out on a balcony. There was a lovely patio outside, and they served a beautiful meal under the stars. And Dallas was very, very glamorous at that time. One of them was Gigi.
Gigi.
Mm-hmm. High and the Mighty, which was a flying film, of course, with Rock Hudson. He was to drool over even if you were married.
All right.
And back then, as you and I have discussed before, Dylan, it was a star system. The stars were really stars, and they were really looked up to. And most of them really did kind of have a code of ethics where they knew that they were a star figure and they wanted to be a good role model. And of course, there were a lot of them that we didn't know anything about until they were gone, because they didn't tell all the things that they tell now about movie stars. Yes, there was a big difference, and when you see them, ones that we thought were just great when we were young, and you see them now on TV or reproduced, and you think, oh my gosh, they were so simple back then, and they were not realistic. You know, they had bar fights and things, or westerns always had bar fights, and they were funny. I mean, they're funny now because we took them seriously then. We thought this was, oh, look at them fighting. But it's nothing now. It's nothing like the realism you have today. Sometimes that was better, I think. But yes, I think it's the realism is good. I think I like that. I'm glad they have a rating system, which there wasn't any need for it back then.
So did you see Gone with the Wind in theaters?
Oh yes, yeah.
How long did they play that in theaters? Was it a one weekend thing, or is it?
Oh, they played it until they thought everybody in the community had seen it, that wanted to see it had seen it, if that's what you're referring to. And also, you know, it was done in 2 parts. They'd have an intermission after the first part because it was so long. An intermission, people would have a chance to use the restrooms, get some more popcorn or whatever. Yeah, it was a very, very popular film. And that was during the war that came out. I think for lots of different reasons, the main one being it took you to places you'd never been. It gave you an opening to lifestyles that you hadn't lived. It was a getaway, I'm sure, for adults, a thing to forget the war, forget the troubles in the 40s. And actually, probably similar to that in the ensuing years, because there's always been some generation that's fighting a war somewhere. And of course that's one thing that's just important and significant to me, because my dad was gone in the Second World War and my husband was during the Korea and Vietnam Wars was in the Air Force. So